Thank you for joining us on our second webcast, and I'm delighted today that Basil, Ralph and Colin are all joining us again, and today they're going to talk to us about the current trends and themes in respect of family office, succession planning, protecting your legacy, amongst probably a lot of other things. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Ralph, who's going to talk to you about protecting your legacy.
Thank you very much, John. Last year, October 2019, I stood in front of about 100 delegates to the Turnstone conference asking the question, how well is your legacy prepared in the event that there's an unplanned world catastrophe taking place? Not knowing that in March we will be in that situation. The American writer Maya Angelou wrote that to live, leave a legacy, make a mark on the world that cannot be removed. And I think that for me is very important. That for me is something to strive towards. And legacy is a collective noun. It takes into consideration not only your wealth, but your vision, your ambition, your goals, the culture that you create for your children and your grandchildren to live in, and also the purpose that you strive to achieve for your family. And we've seen during COVID and lockdown how certain families came through it really, really well, and other families struggled. And there's two characteristics that we saw with families that came through really well that I would like to discuss with you today. And the first one is that they had a very good structured approach to their wealth. And Turnstone used a very simple model, which is called the three-circle model, where there's a balance between the family, the business or the investment, and the ownership thereof. And the idea of the model is just to put families in the frame of mind that a decision that is made on the business level will impact the family, and a life event decision in the family will have implication on the business itself. The other aspect that we saw families had is that their family governance have been to a certain extent formalized. And family governance is something that each and every single family have. And that is the way that a family communicate with each other, the way that they make decisions together. So let's take the example of a young entrepreneur who comes back from work and he sits around the dining table with his young children and he has a discussion about what happened at work, celebrating with his children a big deal that he brought in and explaining how he solved the problem. And then years later, he sits around the same table with his teenage children, having to explain, well, there's cash flow problems at work. And because there's cash flow problems at work, as a family, we have to respond and change our lifestyle. And you know, it's always good to get the view of our teenagers. They look at the world differently than us, and they can give some really good examples and solutions to the problems that we face. So I want to urge you today to start formalizing some of these aspects in order to protect your legacy. And the way of doing that is very simple, and that is to start writing a very formal plan of what it is you want to do. And that plan is not something very complicated, but there's three areas that I would suggest that you consider in doing so. The first one is, how structured is your wealth? Perhaps all your wealth is in South Africa. Perhaps it's time to consider whether it's not possible to bring some of those wealth international and thereby take some of the risk exposure for South Africa away. The second aspect I would urge you to consider is we live in a world where our children want to spread their wings. They want to go and see the world. And the chances that your children will go to a second country to study, meet someone from a third country, and then decide to settle and bring up their children in a fourth culture and fourth country is there, and the probability of that happening is fairly big. Your plan should have the flexibility to provide for them. The third aspect that I would like you to consider is the jurisdiction you are going to use for your legacy. It is not always possible to protect your legacy in your home country, and therefore you have to think further. You have to look and consider different jurisdictions. If your children are going to live worldwide, what is the best place to have your wealth in one central point? What is the risk that that country and that jurisdiction exposed to your family. And what we've learned during COVID, it is so important to consider how governments responded to the crisis. Will your legacy be protected by the way that the government respond? Was your service providers in those countries able to continue serving you as a family with your needs, because everyone in that jurisdiction was able to a certain extent to carry on working? So today, for me, the message that I want to give is that you can leave a mark on the world. You can leave something that your children and grandchildren can be proud of. So please start thinking about these things, start formalizing this, and leave a mark that the world cannot delete. So I hope that is helpful for you. I hope there's something that you can use to give you security and comfort. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Colin, Selu, and Michelle to you, that will explain and talk a little bit more about family offices and what the Isle of Man can offer in terms of family offices.
Rolf's excellent presentation on creating a family legacy is a great place to start talking about family offices. Before we get there, Colin, you moved from South Africa to the Isle of Man over 20 years ago to join Maitland. What makes the Isle of Man such a great place to work and live?
Thanks, Selu. Yes, the Isle of Man, it's a beautiful place to live. It's a safe place to live and provides a wonderful opportunity for a nice work-life balance. But above all, we have interesting and challenging work with an international client base. I often say to people, I have a city-type job with a country lifestyle, and they're only 10 minutes apart. And for me, that is fantastic.
That's great, Colin. Within Maitland, the Isle of Man office is the largest in private client services and is recognized as a center of excellence for complex family matters. Michelle, you're based in Maitland's London office. What is your connection to family offices in the Isle of Man?
Selu, high net worth families have complex needs when it comes to creating, preserving, and managing their wealth. Many of our clients and their businesses are based in London or Europe, even though their structures are managed from the Isle of Man. In London, I have access to a vast network of legal, tax, and investment expertise that are used by family offices we serve globally. It places me in a good position to support my Isle of Man colleagues and other Maitland offices. Clients find comfort in a single firm navigating the different aspects of their business and personal needs across borders.
Thank you, Michelle. Colin, could you give us an understanding of what a family office entails?
Yes, I think a family office, it means different things to different people. Most people, I think, immediately bring the investment function to mind, thinking of someone who's looking for and managing investments. But for us, it's a much wider concept than that. We see it as the place which can hold the family together, a repository of the family's history, of their businesses' interests, of their ethos and their values, and it can play an important role in holding a global family together. So the family office can also play a very important coordination role, where it coordinates services from outside, perhaps. It could be all in-house, where you might find the family office doing the investment function, providing legal advice, setting up structures and running the companies and the underlying entities, managing the wealth, performing charitable and philanthropic needs of the family, or even concierge services as simple as making travel arrangements and so on. So every family is going to be unique to what their needs are.
Sounds great, Colin. I mean, it sounds like every wealthy family should have its own family office. Perhaps I should ask you, Michelle, how much wealth does a family actually need in order to have its own standalone family office?
As a rule of thumb, the cost of the family office should not exceed 50 basis points of the net wealth under administration. You don't want the cost to eat into your profits and your growth. The cost of running a family office also typically vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I'd say for a standalone family office, you're typically looking at a starting value of about 100 million US dollars. If you do a cost-benefit analysis, it will show whether a lesser or a higher amount would be more appropriate.
This is where the concept of a multifamily office comes in.
Good. Yeah.
So if there's still significant wealth, but it doesn't make sense to have your own standalone private office, family office, there are service providers in the Isle of Man, Maitland and others who can offer those services, either to provide all of the family office services or some of them, or to work with a family office that is providing limited services. So for example, you might have service providers here that could provide an outsourced chief investment officer function, for instance, or a legal team, or a team of administrators and accountants doing the accounting work and keeping the structures running. So there's options and opportunities for everybody. The other thing to point out, of course, is in these type of structures with global families, there's always going to be a need for other expertise. And Isle of Man service providers tend to have a very wide network of international connections in specialist areas. So be that an art expert or a yacht or aircraft broker or specialist real estate broker. So the services available and the connections available from the Isle of Man are extensive.
That's great. Michelle, what are the main objectives when one is considering establishing a family office? And also, how do you get buy-in from the family?
We found that the need for more privacy, trust, control, and the personalization of services are key drivers for families wanting to set up a family office. They'll also often have strong views for more specialized investments and an interest in creating a long-term sustainable business. To get family buy-in, it's super important that the family clarify their objectives and goals up front, also taking into account the history of the family. It's also typically recorded in a family constitution. A family constitution serves as a guidebook to the advisors and the family on how to protect the family wealth and also deal with complicated decisions, but always considering the core values of the family.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. Colin, you have the next question. How does an independent advisor like yourself navigate family dynamics and complicated specialized issues?
Yes, they can be complicated and very interesting, Sally. I think we have found that long-serving relationships are the key. Some of our clients from more than 40 years ago are still with us.
That's right, yeah.
And that shows the importance of a long-standing relationship where the advisor gets to know the family and the family's values and ethos. And it's important for your family office advisors to fit the family and for the family to fit them. And it's not only to help in technical issues. Very often you're required to help out in other emotional, perhaps, conundrums. So it reminds me actually of a story. Some years ago I had an elderly gentleman client who sadly passed away. And during his lifetime he made a magnificent art collection which was very large and very valuable. And on his death it was his wish that this collection would be divided between his children and his widow. He had 2 children from a previous marriage, his widow, and 2 children from the then existing marriage. All of them are adults, so we're not dealing with children here. And you can imagine this is a time of grief and sadness. Also, now you're dealing with wealth, a lot of apprehension and nervousness between the parties. You've got children from a former marriage, so the potential for things getting difficult was there. Anyway, we had the collection valued. We sent the valuations out in advance of a meeting, so everybody had a chance to have a good look at them, and they each had an amount to spend, if you like, in choosing an equal share by value of this collection. So we agreed to meet in Zurich. I flew out there, and whilst leaving the airport, I was still puzzling over how am I going to start? How are we going to kick this meeting off? Who's going to get first choice? Anyway, I passed a shop and I saw a pack of cards. I thought, great, bought a pack of cards, went into the meeting. Again, there were the family, very nervous and apprehensive. I walked into the room, the family was there, obviously somber occasion, very nervous and worried about how this might go. And I said, right, we're going to play a game of cards. And that broke the ice quite nicely. I said, right, pick a card. Highest gets to choose first, ace being the highest. So cards went round, they each picked a card. Somebody picked the ace, inevitably. Yeah. So he got first choice. And then the choices were in the order of your cards. The person who picked last in round 1 got first choice in round 2. So we managed to get some fairness there. And it turned into a wonderful occasion. Even comments being made between them saying, oh, I really wanted that one, and oh, that's a fantastic picture that you got. And it turned into a celebration, really, of the deceased family member's life. And I think that's just an illustration of how important it is to understand the family and how an advisor can have a very positive role outside of the technical side of running a family office.
That's a fantastic story, Colin, and thank you very much. It illustrates the value of a trusted advisor to the family. Michelle, what are the dynamics at play when you're looking at multiple generations within a family office context?
Really, family offices serve as a great forum to deal with ever-shifting family dynamics and bridge the multi-generational gap within families. Tech-savvy millennials view money and wealth preservation very different to that of their baby boomer grandparents. And even communication styles between these generations can be quite challenging. So involving the younger generation as early as possible in family operations can motivate them to generate their own wealth. It also improves intergenerational communication, and it definitely helps to address key legacy issues up front.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you, Colin. This unfortunately brings us to the end of our time. However, it leads us nicely into Basil's presentation on entrepreneurs coming to the Isle of Man or using Isle of Man structures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selu. Good morning, goeiemorgen, mora mai to all of you in South Africa. I've lived on the Isle of Man for 20 years, and during this time I've helped a number of companies set up structures on the island. Corporate structuring is a wide field that I will not be able to cover in detail today. However, I would just like to give you a few pointers that you should look at when thinking of structuring in the Isle of Man. When looking to set up a structure, you've got to understand your motives of why you are setting the structure up. These motives can be for asset protection or possibly looking to establish in a new jurisdiction closer to your markets. The latter is a trend that we are finding more and more as people are looking to move around the world. There are different reasons why one would set up a structure in the Isle of Man. An entrepreneur with a new business idea would like to be closer to its market. Perhaps you've got an existing business in South Africa and want to branch out and become closer to your customers or suppliers. And the third reason is to get a branch office or a subsidiary company set up in a jurisdiction that will allow you to trade more efficiently in different areas. Before one decides to set up in the Isle of Man, one should take local advice from a local advisor. This advisor should have detailed knowledge on how to set up structures and detailed knowledge of the laws in South Africa that are applicable when somebody is looking to set a business up offshore. This advisor should have detailed knowledge and experience in setting up offshore structures. His knowledge of South African tax, exchange controls, and all other legal issues will allow you to set up a successful structure that will save costs in the long run. This advisor should also understand the nuances of common reporting standards and the US FATCA regulations. In an earlier presentation, John went through in detail the factors that one should consider when looking at an offshore jurisdiction. Stability and safety of the environment that a business can operate in, which is critical to the well-being of your employees. And the second factor that I'd like to highlight is the approachable, innovative and supportive government that the Isle of Man has, which makes it simple to settle down and get your business going when you've decided to move here. The Isle of Man has a number of leading licensed businesses and advisors that will be able to set up the appropriate structure for you. Once the structure has been set up, they will either manage it for you or assist those individuals that are on the ground in the Isle of Man. It is critical that the structure that is put in place builds on the advice that has been received in South Africa. The advisors here on the Isle of Man will consult with your advisors in South Africa and put the appropriate structure together. The usual structure is made up of trusts or companies of different types. I will not go into the details of the different types of companies that we have on the Isle of Man, as it will be specific to each individual situation. However, startup and small companies or companies holding single assets will normally use a licensed corporate service provider to set up the company and manage it until it has sufficient size where its own office is appropriate. It is critical to build on the advice that you received in South Africa before you set up any structure. There are a number of different types of companies and business vehicles that can be used. However, we do not have the time at the moment to go into all of these. Later in the series, the Locate Isle of Man team will detail the simplicity and benefits of moving to the Isle of Man, which are numerous. The large South African community that has developed on the island in the last 20 years is testament to the wonderful way of life that we have here. I'd now like to hand back to John, who will lead the question and answer session.
Delighted to be joined again by Ralph, by Colin and Basil, and even more delighted to be joined by Michelle from Maitland in London. We've had a few questions in, and the first one, perhaps Ralph, I could ask you to perhaps tell us about what role does a jurisdiction actually play in protecting the legacy and the succession planning for an individual?
Yeah. John, I think it is the choice of jurisdiction for me is a very, very important choice to make. Every family should have go through a process of establishing what their risks are and how to mitigate those risks. And therefore the choice of jurisdiction should mitigate some of the risks that the family face. As an example, if you live in a country where there's which is politically unstable, you would like your wealth to be settled in a jurisdiction which is stable, that can give you that security that things will be done well in future. Other thing that I also think perhaps is important, as I said earlier, we live in an age where our children will live worldwide in multiple jurisdictions. And if you want to have a family meeting and your governance is more formal, you want a jurisdiction which is central, which is easy to come to, easy access from America, the East and Europe, yet provide everything else. It should be a jurisdiction that adds value to the family rather than just another jurisdiction which is chosen. And I think the other thing which is also important is to look at the advisors which is in the country. You want to have not only good quality advisors which are skilled, but you want to have a variety and a depth in terms of the skill set that is available within the jurisdiction, so that if something has to be addressed, there's access to those advisors to be able to do so.
That all makes perfect sense. Basil, anything you'd like to add?
I think, as Rolf has said, the advisor having detailed knowledge and worked in this field before is vital. What I've seen before is families and individuals going to advisors that are more concerned with their own businesses rather than the individual's businesses, and that is vital to ensure that you've worked with somebody who's knowledgeable and experienced.
In terms of the individual, maybe Colin, you could answer this one for us. It's a common question. It comes up quite a lot. is what's the sort of minimum wealth that's required to look at a family governance type structure?
I think if you're looking at governance and family office, so it can be distinguished. So in terms of a family office and net wealth, we generally look at what is the net wealth, and you probably don't want to be spending more than about 50 basis points of your net wealth on the cost of running your family office. So that's going to depend on jurisdictions and your individual requirements. In terms of governance, I think Rolf is probably well placed to respond to that part of the question.
Yeah, I think I like the distinction that you make between family office and family governance, because I think the one leads into the other one, but they are not mutually exclusive of each other. And I don't think there's ever a minimum requirement for family wealth in order to have good family governance, the way that families communicate. And the principle for me would be that is to encourage any person that has wealth to have open and frank discussions with their family about the wealth, preparing the children for one day receiving that wealth. And that is family governance, it's the way that the family communicate. And you don't need to have any wealth in order to have those discussions. But as the family grows and as the wealth becomes more complex, then the need for more formal structures is there, leading eventually into the family office, which Colin and Silo and Michelle have spoken about. So I think it's a bit of a misconception with individuals waiting to put structures in place because they don't think they're wealthy enough. You know, make it part of the family culture to talk about the wealth. Make it part of the family culture to prepare the children to one day deal with the wealth.
And in fact, that helps when you do come to creating the formal structures, because you have those foundations.
Correct.
The family already understands the bigger picture, as it were, and the importance of ensuring that that is kept and maintained and strengthened for the future.
The formal structures should be based on the natural structures that is already there in the family.
I've found a lot of people are setting up structures for completely the wrong reasons, and that it is proven costly to them, and it erodes that family wealth right at the beginning, and they've done it incorrectly.
That leads really nicely on to the next question, and maybe if I can ask Michelle. Michelle, you know, what in your opinion does the structure of a family office typically look like?
John, typically a family office will operate as a company that services the need of the family. And it can operate as a lone standing company or as part of a more intricate trust and company structure that is within the structure of the family. It all depends on where the family is residing and whether it makes sense to service their personal needs. So it can be as complicated or it can be as simple as the family's needs dictate it to be.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Michelle. Gentlemen, anything you'd like to add in terms of your feeling for family office structuring?
Well, I was just going to say, I think family offices in the multifamily office environment can bring opportunities as well for clients. And particularly if you're in a multifamily office situation where you have an advisor servicing different families, obviously being mindful of confidentiality and so on, there can be opportunities. So, for example, we had a situation where one client was cash asset rich, but it wasn't generating sufficient income for the time being for their requirements, and we were able to. We had other clients who had excess cash, and in this low interest environment, they were looking for decent investment, and we were able to put together a syndicated loan agreement where the excess cash clients were able to earn a better return on their money. The borrower was able to obtain financing at far better rates than the usual bridge financing. So those kind of opportunities can come to the fore. And in the Isle of Man, where we do have fantastic collaboration with one another as businesses, it's very often the case that although we may not have a client who needs something, but we can offer to someone else. And the fact that we collaborate together improves the opportunities for doing business together, and ultimately for the better of both sets of clients, whether they're your own or the competitors.
it's so heartening to hear in the world of financial services businesses that really put their customers at the heart of everything that they do. And I believe that is definitely an ethos that exists in the Isle of Man. So I'm now a very ultra-high net worth customer. I'd like to set a family office up, but I don't really want to relinquish control over my assets. So how would that work, and is there a way that I would be able to keep control of my assets?
That's completely understandable. I think that's a question that we get a lot of times, and it's very difficult for the patriarch or the matriarch to just relinquish control. And again, it's very specific to the needs of the family and what makes sense depending on their planning and the jurisdiction that they reside in. But typically, you can even look to incorporate family members on the board of a company. They can be on an advisory board, or they can act as a protector or an enforcer on trust structures that we set up. It really is intricate to the family, and it depends on the planning for them.
So it sounds to me like lots of flexibility there to
Yes.
put together whatever you would like to put together.
There definitely is some flexibility to incorporate.
Who would like to take the answer for that question?
That's a very common question. Clients say, I've worked very hard. How do I know that my hard-earned wealth is in safe hands? Fundamentally, it comes down to trust, of course. You need to know your advisors, trust your advisors, have proper advice around you, be in a reputable jurisdiction where there is good regulation, and so on. And then it's down to individual planning. It depends where people are in the world, where they're resident, what their businesses are. There are many tools that one can use to provide some level of comfort. It may not be full control, but some insight and comfort. Things from private trustee companies, perhaps where a family member sits on the board of that private trustee company, or a protector of a trust, or a director of a company, or perhaps an advisory panel. You may have an investment committee where different members, professionals may sit on that committee together with family members who then advise your trustees or company directors on investments. So there are multiple tools. There's no one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, I think it's. I agree with Colin. That's a very thorough answer for Colin. But again, for me, it comes back to the jurisdiction as well. Does the jurisdiction have regulation in place that would protect customer or a client in the case where he has to relinquish some of his control? So for me, that is just one of the other aspects to keep in mind is well regulation within a country.
A very, very important point. Anything, Basil, you'd like to?
I would think it comes back to the planning right at the beginning and understanding why you're doing what you're doing and why you're protecting your wealth. I'd like to take it to businessmen setting up on the Isle of Man as well, where they're simply using the Isle of Man as a jurisdiction of choice to get close to markets. A lot of businesses that set up need other directors and directors who control their companies for them, and that trust factor is vital, and putting the right people in place that are well regulated and understand and are knowledgeable about the industry that business is vitally important.
Which leads nicely on to another question, and I know Michelle's got a view on this. Is, would a high net worth need to be based in the Isle of Man or resident in the Isle of Man to have his family office here?
Well, like Colin said earlier as well, he is loving life in the Isle of Man, and I've been visiting the Isle of Man for the past 2 years, twice a year or so, and the people are really lovely. So I would recommend that if you can go to the Isle of Man, you should, because it is a lovely place to live. But typically, when you do go to the Isle of Man, there are favourable planning opportunities. For instance, there's no inheritance tax there and no capital gains tax. But it is also specifically very favourable for clients that don't live in the Isle of Man, and it slots in very nicely with their offshore planning. So it is actually more beneficial for a lot of our clients that are based in, say, South Africa or Europe or even in the States, to have their structures be managed from the Isle of Man. So you don't have to be there.
That's really, really
To
good.
enjoy the benefits of the Isle of Man. But you should go visit if you can.
Thanks very much, Michelle. That's really interesting. And I think we all agree that the Isle of Man is a great place to live. However, there is the ability to operate a family office here without being resident. Do you agree?
Absolutely. There's no requirement to be here. It's a lovely place to be, but no requirement to be so. Isle of Man's very used to dealing internationally with other advisors, looking after assets located elsewhere. So it's a fantastic jurisdiction to be in, to do it from, but no need for the family to actually be here.
I think that what's shown in the last 6 months with the COVID crisis is that business has continued, and how we've managed through the various communication links that we've got to carry on doing business and look after families all over the world.
But it does come down to the planning. I mean, you've got to do things properly. You've got to have proper advice, and that's going to be custom for each individual, and that is the key.
That's the key. I would agree with that. And I think there's various options that can be dealt with as well. I think it would be ideal, in an ideal world, if a family do plan to send perhaps a child or a grandchild over to come and assist in helping manage the wealth, but it's certainly not required.
So by way of summing up, perhaps I could ask you all just to give a brief summary of why you think that the Isle of Man is the ideal place to protect your legacy or establish your family office, or simply to locate your financial structure.
I'll go first. I think the Isle of Man for me is the ideal place to do so. I think history has shown the stability of the Isle of Man. It shows that the Isle of Man is the Isle of Man is entrepreneurial in its approach, that it supports businesses and initiatives in the Isle of Man. The quality and depth of our advisors for me stands out as something that adds value. But also it creates that opportunity that if one of the family members wish to move to the Isle of Man, they'll find that there is support to facilitate that, to make that happen. The stability of government, the stability of the economy, those are all contributing factors to making this a great place for private wealth.
Super, thank you.
I think from my point of view is how welcoming the Isle of Man is. South Africans feel very welcome here, and they're comfortable. And then the government has put in a lot of schemes and procedures that allow a business to flourish here, and the support that is given to businesses and family offices from the government is vital, and people coming to the Isle of Man fit in so easily and quickly.
It's difficult to follow and add much more, because I agree with what you both said, Rolf and Basil. I think to add a more technical element as well, of course, I think is the stability of our legal system here, a long tradition of parliamentary rule, which provides the stability, a well-regulated jurisdiction that really wants to be a good international citizen, and our government has been very clear about that throughout the more than 20 years that I've lived here. To make it a good place to be, but not only a good place to be, but to be a good place to be seen in, and that's important too.
That's super. A big thank you to Colin, to Basil, and to Ralph, and a really big thank you to Michelle in London. I hope everybody's staying safe there, and I hope you'll join us for webinar 3, where we'll talk about private wealth management services and what the Isle of Man can deliver. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for joining us today. Before we turn to the question and answer session, just like to remind you that our third web broadcast will be on the 26th of October, where we'll be discussing why the Isle of Man is the natural choice for wealth management. And this will be presented to you with representatives from Standard Bank, from Nedbank, and from Capital International. So, first question that's come in today is, sorry, we'll read that there. How can I recommend and be comfortable to place my clients' funds in the Isle of Man as a jurisdiction?
Well, a number of reasons. The well regulated. It holds a double A rating by Moody's, so at the higher level, macro level, it's stable, well recognized financial center. We have a very robust and modern regulations. So service providers in the industry are required to be licensed. Our regulator is actively involved. We do come around and do inspections and so on. So from that point of view, it's very good. And then getting down to the next level down is obviously the choice of your providers. There's a wide range of reputable providers here, service providers. But ultimately, as I said before, it's built on trust. You need to meet the people you're dealing with and develop that rapport. I suppose that's natural in any relationship. But you'll find when the borders are open after our COVID crisis, come and visit and meet the people, meet the regulators, and I think you'll get a lot of comfort from that.
Yeah, for me, the one thing that for me always stands out is not only the amount of skills that we have in the Isle of Man, but also the depth thereof. So there's not only just one single advisor that can help you, there's a variety of advisors. And as Colin has said, for me, it comes down to building a relationship with those advisors. And yes, there are very approachable companies, and most companies in the Isle of Man is very approachable. And I want to encourage you, please reach out to us, make contact with us, and you will find that we are approachable, understanding what your needs are and providing solutions that will work for you.
That's really interesting. Hopefully that's answered that question. And hi to Lucia. Lucia, thank you very much for your question. And the question is, the world seems to be in turmoil with COVID-19. So how has the Isle of Man managed to negotiate through chaos?
I think we are very lucky to be having a very proactive government. I think that for me was the start of it. A government that listened to professional advice, medical advice that was given, and the measures that was put in place was measures that actually assisted the problem. Not being protected, not keeping them in place for longer than what is necessary, but government responding very quickly to bringing life back to normal for us as soon as what it was possible to do so. So although we've got no social distancing requirements in the Isle of Man any longer, you will find that most companies still has a measure of social distancing. We're protecting our staff, we are protecting our clients thereby, and therefore we are able to provide clients 100% service as normal. There were many other things that was done. Restaurants was closed for a long period of time. It feels like an age ago that we started with lockdown. So I really have to think back, Colin. I don't know if you can remember some of the other measures that was put in place.
I think it's also important that businesses were able to move to working from home fairly quickly and that we have in terms of internet connections and so on. So most businesses, there probably were some hiccups here and there, but most businesses were able to move to almost business as normal in terms of service fairly quickly, with great support from government, as Hilton mentioned, and continues to be the case with borders closed and keeping it at bay. So far, we fingers crossed that it will continue to be good.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. Really interesting question here, which says, as a choice of jurisdiction, what factors might make the Isle of Man a better choice than, say, Jersey? Now, we're both very, very different jurisdictions, and I think it would kind of be unfair for us to comment on that on air, other than to point to the fact that the Isle of Man has a very diverse economy, less reliance in terms of financial services, a lower cost base, and 85,000 people in 225 square miles. And that probably leads us on to the next question that's come through, which says, you've described the Isle of Man as a safe and secure jurisdiction. What does actually that mean in reality? So, gentlemen, perhaps you can kind of translate those words into what it's like to be here.
business point of view, what does that look like? The regulation we have a government and regulators that interact with the business community regularly, so there's stability in that sense. We don't have a regulation and rules stopping and changing all the time, so that gives you stability from a business point of view. We don't have tax rates that are changing every time there's a change in government. That is stability and safe and security. From a personal point of view, it's wonderful. Personal security. I just take the weekend, for example. On Saturday, I got on my mountain bike and went for a ride on my own, no problem, up on the hills. On Sunday, I went walking with my wife along the coast, along what's known as the Rodney Column, which is the coastal path around the island. Absolutely beautiful, not a care in the world. You can just walk out the door. If you forget to lock it, it doesn't matter. For me, that is safety and security.
Yeah, I think, Colin, I'm going to sit a little bit closer so that you can hear me better. I think we do try and close our front door just so that the rain doesn't come in. But that is the biggest concern we have, is that rain would come into the house, so therefore we close the front door. Safety and security, having left South Africa and coming to the Isle of Man, for us was a huge shock to realize how safe we can live. I've got two daughters, 15 and 13. For them, it's nothing strange to get on public transport and move to Douglas, and thereby come and visit us in the office, have a day in town during holidays. It is a safe environment to live in, and as a parent, I'm not overly concerned about my children being alone on public transport or walking alone in town. There's many forests that I go for walks in, even after dark, just go and have a walk because it is safe and secure. So those elements for me is very important. I think as a community, people look after each other as well. So you will often find that if there's a child that has run away a bit too far from its parents in town, someone will help the child to find its parents again. And I think that is not something that I would like to change for anything in life, especially during COVID. The measures that is in place makes you feel safe because it is safe. And people are looking after each other. I think that for me is the biggest thing. The community work together to make the Isle of Man a safe place and keep it a safe place to live in.
Very interesting. And I would just endorse that. I came here 12 years ago on a short-term contract and liked it so much that I stayed. Just like to say thank you very much for everybody for joining us today. I hope you're all safe. Just a reminder that our third edition will be published on the 26th of October, where we'll talk about why the Isle of Man is the natural choice for wealth management. So thank you very much.